Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about muscle physiology and we're going to cover three key graphs that sometimes come up in exams. And that's the length tension relationship, the load tension relationship, and the load velocity relationship. So to begin with, let's just cover really basic muscle physiology and we'll talk about a sarcomere, which is the contracting unit of the muscle. So the three main things you need to know about it to understand these graphs is that in red, we have myosin, and this is also known as the thick filament. And this is the part of the sarcomere that has little legs on it that are just drawn here that will pull against the actin, which is the thin filament, to then contract by pulling the actin inwards and over itself, which will shorten the sarcomere. Then there's a protein called titin, and this is the elastic filament in green. And what this is that as the muscle stretches, titin will also stretch, and this is an anchoring protein that will anchor your myosin to your actin at the ends here. And once it's overstretched and you've got less of the actin that's covering the myosin, they help to pull the muscle back together. So now let's talk about our length tension relationship. And on our y-axis, we would have our tension developed as a percentage, 100 being the highest you can get. And then on the x-axis, we have the length of the sarcomere, which we just spoke about, and this is in micrometers. So if we start down the bottom here, we have a short sarcomere with low tension. And that represents the sarcomere here with overlapping actin filaments and your myosin basically touching the ends. Now, as we lengthen the sarcomere, our tension will build. And then we reach a point where we're at 100% of our developed tension and a bit of a plateau forms. And this is at around 2.2 micrometers. And that's really important because this is optimal sarcomere length for muscle tension. And it becomes important in things like the Starling law of the heart, where this is the optimal length, where once you start going above this, your contractility versus the stretch of the myocyte decreases. And this is important because at this optimal length, you essentially have the right amount of myosin and actin overlap and the right amount of tension and stretch within the titin elastic filaments. Then as we continue to stretch the sarcomere, you can see that tension decreases. And this occurs because, as you can see here, you have less of the myosin heads attached to the actin, and your elastic filament is essentially overstretched here as well. Now, this graph relates to the next graph because we talk about load tension relationship here. And load tension relationship is interesting because we can talk about our max tension on our y-axis here, and then we talk about muscle length and multiples of resting length here, and this is a surrogate for load because as load increases, our length will also increase. Okay. Now, the developed tension is essentially the exact same curve as our load tension relationship, where it goes up and at about 1.0, which is the optimal length at 2.2 micrometers, we're at our optimal developed tension. And then as it goes down, or as the muscle lengthens, we lose this tension, which we described before. But then as these thick and thin filaments stop overlapping, you essentially get the only thing that's sort of pulling the muscle back together is actually the elastic properties of the muscle and collagen and tendons and titin elastic filaments. And that starts once you go above the average resting length, and eventually it overtakes the developed tension and goes up above up to 100%. Now, if you go beyond 100%, essentially this will cause rupture of tendons and muscle because the only thing holding the muscle together and creating tension is the elastic properties of the muscle. So it's nothing to do with the actual active developed tension at this point. In red here, we have the total tension, which is a combination of our developed and our passive tension. And you can see here, it goes up, it starts to decrease, and then as the elastic or passive tension takes over, it will go back up. And again, like we mentioned, once you go above 100%, that's when you're likely to get injuries such as muscle tearing and tendon rupture. Now, lastly, we'll talk about load-velocity relationship. And this is a bit easier to explain. Essentially, on the y-axis, we have velocity, and this is in centimeters per second. And it doesn't really matter the number, but I just put 30 up the top because some textbooks will say this as well. And then we've got our load opposing contraction, and this is in kilograms. And again, the number's less important because it's dependent on the person and how well trained they are, but up to 4 kilograms I've got here. So as you have a load that's opposed to the muscle, as expected, you have a decrease in your velocity. So if our load was 0 kilograms, we have maximum velocity that the muscle can generate. And then as our load increases, our velocity decreases. And then eventually we reach a point where the opposing load can't be overcome by the muscle, so our velocity is 0 because the muscle can't be moved. And this is for something that everyone could probably relate to. If you're trying to lift a weight and you just can't move it, then that load opposing you is greater than the velocity you can generate. And you can essentially see that here, because if your load is increasing and your muscle is stretching in our middle graph, eventually you reach a point where you can't develop any more tension because your tension has hit 0. And your passive tension has reached the max that can be achieved. So you're unable to move the object that you're trying to pick up, which means that your velocity is 0. And that's how these 3 graphs are related to each other. On a side note, you can apply these graphs to the real world because, for example, if you tried to lift a 20 kilogram dumbbell in one arm, most of us probably couldn't realistically, be able to actually contract our bicep against that weight. So you would have a velocity of 0. But then why can I have my arm bent, then hold that weight and not let my arm eccentrically let the weight drop? But before I couldn't even contract against it. And that's because when we put our arm at a 90-degree angle and we hold that weight, we're able to hold it in place. And our velocity remains 0 because, again, that weight is opposing our ability to actually contract. But we've now placed the weight at the point on our developed tension curve where we have optimal tension, so we can hold that weight. And it's easier than before when we're trying to actually contract against the weight. You may also experience this, for example, if you're trying to contract your bicep and you've got your arm out straight. The hardest bit of the contraction is usually the start, and then you're able to get more momentum and speed. And that's because your muscle is stretched and sitting about here, where you can't develop a lot of tension because your developed tension is sitting here. So this is your active tension, while your passive tension is just the stretch of your muscles holding the weight. So that's why you might see people at the gym, they swing the dumbbell, and as they swing it, they bring the arm into an optimal position to actually contract against, and then they're able to contract on that last, say, 50% of the contraction to get the dumbbell up. So they're just some applications of these graphs to the real world. Now, there's many other applications, but one of the more relevant ones to mention that may come up in exams is the optimal tension relationship here for length tension. And that's because in the Starling law of the heart, you would have your preload, which is on the y-axis, and then usually you have your contractility, you have your preload on the x-axis and your contractility on the y-axis. You get a graph that looks like that, and that's because optimal tension here, optimal stretch, is when the sarcomere is at about 2.2 micrometers. So that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching. If you guys have anything that you want to add, anything you want me to cover, feel free to leave it in the comments.